So, the farmer says to his wife, "The cows are insisting we take them to the mall this weekend." "Why do they want to go to the mall?" asked the farmer's wife. "Because they're tired of ordering from catalogs." In our last episode, we showed that Randy and Dean have different internal prices for beer and for cheese production. We asked, would it still be mutually beneficial for them to trade? In this segment, we answer that question by bringing in a middleman, a trader, to convince Randy and Dean to do just that. We show that a middleman that buys low and sells high can facilitate trade between Randy and Dean, even if neither had considered it before. We also define two phrases economists use, absolute and comparative advantage. Contrary to the popular saying that there is no free lunch, in this episode we demonstrate that trade, in fact, offers a free lunch. Finally, after the video, you should understand why economic forces and the invisible hand of the marketplace have led to the outcome of near full specialization of production in our modern economy. So, let's start by assuming that Randy and Dean both spend 4 hours brewing beer and 4 hours making cheese. Now meet our trader, Kenny. Kenny can make profits by inducing Randy and Dean to trade, maybe without Randy or Dean knowing that they are trading with each other. How? It's as easy as cheese. Step 1. Kenny offers to purchase 1 keg of beer from Dean in exchange for 0.81 wedges of cheese. Would Dean agree to the proposed deal? Yes. Examine Dean's production possibilities frontier to understand why. Suppose Dean works 12 more minutes brewing beer and 12 fewer minutes making cheese. In the extra 12 minutes he spends making beer, he can brew 1 more keg. But since he is spending 12 fewer minutes making cheese, he forgoes 12 over 15, or 0.8 wedges of cheese. But Kenny has promised Dean 0.81 wedges of cheese. So Dean is 0.01 wedges of cheese better off than before Kenny proposed the trade. And for this reason, he will agree to Kenny's deal. Now, step 2. What does Kenny the trader do with that 1 keg of beer he bought from Dean? He offers to sell it to Randy, of course, for 0.89 wedges of cheese. Does Randy accept Kenny's offer? Yes. If Randy brews 1 less keg of beer, he frees up 6 minutes of time that he can use to make cheese. In those 6 minutes of time, he can make 0.9 wedges of cheese. If Kenny only charges Randy 0.89 wedges of cheese for that keg of beer, Randy keeps 0.01 more wedges of cheese than before meeting Kenny. After trading with Kenny, Dean and Randy are both strictly better off. Dean and Randy each consume more cheese and the same amount of beer as before. Kenny also makes a profit. Kenny receives 1 keg of beer from Dean and sells that keg of beer to Randy, so that's a wash. But Kenny receives 0.89 wedges of cheese from Randy and only delivers 0.81 wedges of cheese to Dean. So Kenny makes 0.08 wedges of cheese for his troubles. It's a good business. Now in the real world, if it's literally this easy to be a trader, then trading profits will not be this lucrative. Traders will propose increasingly sweeter deals to Dean and to Randy to win their business. This will cause profits to fall for Kenny, from 0.08 wedges of cheese to a smaller margin, approximating the cost of operating a trading business. The reduction in profits for Kenny will mean that Dean and Randy will enjoy even more cheese as a result of trade than in our example. But wait a second, how did Dean and Randy get more without working harder? I thought that in life, there was no free lunch. No free lunch. No free lunch. No free lunch. Randy and Dean each consume more cheese and the same amount of beer after trade. And they don't work any harder. Trade gave Randy and Dean a free lunch. Yoink.
Hey, That's my lunch.
The reason is that trade allows people to specialize in what they can efficiently produce. The increase in efficiency creates more output with the same number of hours worked. After the trade, Randy and Dean each work the same amount as before, 8 hours a day. But Randy and Dean's combined output of cheese increased, while Randy and Dean's combined output of beer remained steady. The introduction of trade is like the invention of a new technology that made Randy and Dean more productive. Trade is like magic. It delivers something for nothing. So, where did these magical gains in output come from? Let's review the game tape. If we look at trade patterns that Kenny facilitated, after trade, Dean spends more time brewing beer and less time making cheese. Randy, on the other hand, spends more time making cheese and less time brewing beer. So why did Kenny facilitate these changes in production? It turns out that it has something to do with prices. Kenny bought beer from Dean and sold it to Randy, and Dean is the low-cost producer of beer. 1 keg of beer only costs Dean 0.8 wedges of cheese. In contrast, 1 keg costs Randy 0.9 wedges. Kenny bought cheese from Randy and sold it to Dean, and Randy is the low-cost producer of cheese. 1 wedge of cheese costs Randy 1.11 kegs of beer, whereas 1 wedge costs Dean 1.25 kegs. The trader, Kenny, makes profits by following the old rule, buy low and sell high. Kenny bought each good from its lowest cost producer, cheese from Randy and beer from Dean, and sold it to the other guy. So now, why does Randy trade with Dean? Randy can produce both more beer per hour and more cheese per hour than Dean can, and for this reason, it looks like Randy has nothing to gain by trading with Dean. Using the language of economics, Randy has absolute advantage in production of both goods. But the key observation is that Randy's time spent working is fixed at 8 hours per day. If Randy wants more beer, he must produce less cheese. We have worked out Randy's exact trade-off of beer for cheese. It is the internal price we calculated earlier. Dean has a different internal price, and trade becomes possible when people like Randy and Dean have different internal prices. Thus, absolute advantage has nothing to do with trade. Absolute advantage, which is related to overall hourly output, does not determine trade flows. Instead, economists say comparative advantage determines trade flows. The person with the comparative advantage in the production of a good, by definition, is the low-cost producer of that good. In our example, Dean has a comparative advantage in producing beer because he has to forgo fewer wedges of cheese to make 1 more keg of beer than Randy does. Analogously, Randy has the comparative advantage in making cheese. He has to forgo fewer kegs of beer to produce another wedge of cheese than Dean does. Since we are all different, everyone has a comparative advantage. For most of us, our comparative advantage steers us towards our career path. The invisible hand of the marketplace, or in our example, the more visible hand of Kenny, encourages us to specialize in what we're relatively good at doing. Randy's comparative advantage is in making cheese. Although he started out by spending 4 hours making beer and 4 hours making cheese, the marketplace, i.e. Kenny, dictated that Randy should spend more time making cheese and less time making beer. Randy agreed to do this because he realized he would be better off. Given Kenny's offer, he consumed more cheese and the same amount of beer. Dean's comparative advantage is brewing beer, and like Randy, he started out spending 4 hours making cheese and 4 hours brewing beer. But the marketplace dictated he spend more time brewing beer and less time making cheese. Dean agreed to this arrangement because it enabled him to consume more cheese and the same amount of beer. Ultimately, these market forces will lead Randy to spend all his time making cheese and Dean to spend all his time brewing beer, and trade between them will occur. This arrangement will lead to more output for Randy and for Dean than if they each brewed beer and made cheese. This is likely the reason why the labor force in a developed economy is so highly specialized. Given our relative strengths and possibly our preferences, we choose to completely specialize, that is, to work one full-time job in the area in which we have a comparative advantage, because that leads to a higher standard of living. So, let's sum up what we have learned about trade. First off, despite what some people say, trade allows for the possibility of a free lunch. Randy and Dean consume more cheese and the same amount of beer, and they don't work any longer. Second, as long as people have different skills, there are likely going to be trading opportunities. Even though Randy has an absolute advantage in the production of beer and cheese, he finds it worthwhile to trade with Dean. We measure trading opportunities using the idea of comparative advantage. The relatively low-cost producer of a good has the comparative advantage in that good. People specialize in production in the good in which they have a comparative advantage. And finally, the benefits of trade and specialization lead to the outcome we observe, of near full specialization in production. You can think of Kenny literally as a trader that makes specialization and trade happen, or you can view him as a metaphor for the invisible hand of the marketplace that, according to the paradigm of economics, guides many of our decisions, such as the decision to specialize. Now, what do you say? Shall we move on to the next video?